Hello and welcome to the Ukrainian Studies Organization at Indiana University. I'm Natalia Shpilova-Said and thank you for attending our talk today. Today we have the opportunity of speaking with David Williams, and he presents on forging a social contract in Ukraine. David Williams graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Law School after earning the Sarah Sears Prize for being first in his class. Williams then clerked for Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit and taught at Cornell Law School before relocating to Indiana University in 1991. The School of Law named him the John Hastings Professor of Law, and the university named him its Distinguished Faculty Research Lecturer in 2003. David Williams has twice won the Wallace Teaching Award, as well as the Fromm Public Interest Faculty Award. David Williams has written widely on constitutional design, Native American law, the constitutional treatment of difference, and the relationship between constitutionalism and political violence. He's the author of the Mythic Meanings of the Second Amendment, Taming Political Violence in a Constitutional Republic, which was published in 2003. As executive director of the Center for Constitutional Democracy, David Williams consults with a number of reform movements abroad. He has also advised reformers in Libya, Yemen, Vietnam, Laos, Cuba, Jordan, South Sudan, Ukraine, Ireland, and other countries. Like always, we will start with the lecture. Please submit your comments via our Q&A option. And at this point, I would like to welcome again David Williams, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Natalia. It's a great pleasure to be here. I should begin with a confession. As you know, I advise constitutional reform abroad, and some people in Ukraine asked me to come and think about amending the Constitution to anticipate future difficulties. But I've only been there twice. I talked with a lot of people in government, people in politics, people in CSOs, people in universities, and I learned a great deal. And I came to like the country, in fact, even really love the country quite a bit. And of course, all of our concern now is with recent developments there. Now, I preface all that by saying that I do know something about the country, but not nearly as much as you do, or I am sure as many of the people who are joining us do. So what I'm about to offer are some tentative, some preliminary thoughts about the social contract in Ukraine and its relationship to constitutionalism. But these are thoughts in progress. And so I'm especially interested in what our viewers might have to say. So when I was there, a lot of people kept telling me, let me just share my screen here. When I would ask people, what do you think about the government and what do you think about Ukraine's future? What I kept hearing was this. Ukraine has become an electoral democracy, and that's kind of great news. And by that, what I mean is it holds elections. We know that some of them were fraudulent, but we also know that many of them were relatively free and fair. And we also know that the parties in power have shifted in and out. So we've been getting some alternation in power. And that's what we look for when we're thinking about whether Ukraine is becoming a consolidated democracy. So that's really good news. On the other hand, lots of people are really, really unhappy with the government. And it seems to me that that is in part because Ukraine has not yet become a thoroughly constitutional democracy. And so I want to talk about what that means and why it hasn't happened, at least in my perception. Now, elections are important. They really matter. They're one way to control our elected leaders. But the truth is, all they really do is pose an outside limit, right? If we really don't like the people in office, the next go round, we can turn them out. But in between elections, most people have very little influence on government directly. Now, except in very small countries and very unusual circumstances, this is just the reality. And so elections are never enough to produce good government because voters really control politicians only on election day. Now, in between, we've got to think about what we can do. And there are a number of different things to do, but at least one of those is constitutionalism. So it's this idea that even when you win an election, it doesn't mean you get to do anything you want to do. It doesn't mean you get to hunt down your opponents and kill them. It doesn't mean you get to steal money from the treasury. It doesn't mean that you get to infinitely expand your power, no matter who you might be in the government. There are limits in between. Now, the most important way, the most effective way to ensure that those limits are observed is checks and balances. So that what we do is within government, we divide power and try to distribute it among a number of different actors who will keep a check on each other so that nobody becomes too powerful. Because as we know, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. All right, so the goal here then is checks and balances. Now, I asked a lot of people whether this scenario sounds familiar in Ukraine, and everybody said it did. Everybody, by the way, I should say, in the US feels the same way. So we hold free and fair elections over and over, good elections, right? And despite what some people say, the 2020 election in the United States was really free and fair. But over and over, we get these politicians and they come in and they just seem self-serving and corrupt, like they're the same people again. And sometimes, even when, as in Ukraine, the voters turn out the incumbents in massive numbers and they elect political outsiders, it still seems like the new politicians are the same as the old politicians, right? So elections here really are not working. So what's wrong? Now, Freud is said to have said, perhaps apocryphally, that the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over and expect a different result next time. So you keep electing people and you just expect somehow this time will be really different. But often that just doesn't happen. And that's because the system is returning the same types of personality and creating the same kind of a situation. And so no matter how much we yearn for some savior at the next election to redeem us, somehow the next time the politicians will be different, it never seems to happen. And when that's the case, eventually it's time to think that maybe the problem is the underlying structure. In other words, the Constitution. So it becomes important to amend the Constitution so as to change the politics. And that's what constitutions mostly do, is they give rise to a type of politics. And if you're unhappy with your politics, it's probably not because of your politicians. It's probably because of the underlying structure. Okay, now, if the Constitution is wrong, if checks and balances are wrong, there's usually two causes, and they're often linked. So the first is you might have the wrong system of checks and balances. For example, an overpowerful executive president. And indeed, worldwide, this is the single most significant cause of constitutional turbulence and instability. Presidents tend to pull power to themselves. And then we no longer have a system of checks and balances. We have a single hierarchy with a single apex in which one person is dictating most events. Now, linked to that, though, is that it's not just the particular system of checks and balances, is that the country has not really become constitutionalist yet. And by that, what I mean is the people have not embraced or do not understand checks and balances. They're looking for salvation from another place, usually, again, this very strong leader figure. And they don't view the Constitution as their own because they don't feel like they made it. So it's something that just came from the blue, or sometimes from politicians or from elite deals. And so they don't really feel like they can make it work, and they don't care about it. Now, the result of that, of course, is going to be that the politicians do not feel constrained by a rule of law culture, because they do not feel that the people will insist on it, either because they don't care that much, or they don't understand it, or they don't really feel that government does or could belong to them. Now, this is what I kept hearing people say over and over in Ukraine. Now, these two causes, the overpowerful president and the absence of constitutionalism among the people, they're often frequently linked. So what happens is the Constitution allows for the concentration of power, the over-concentration of power, usually in an executive president. And because the people don't really understand checks and balances, what they're really doing is they're asking for the president to save them. And so they gladly allow the president to increase his or her power over time. And so they're really just thinking the next time we'll get the perfect leader and everything will be okay. But then again, it never works out that way. So one answer to this is popular constitution making. And this is what I have seen around the world, that a country really doesn't become thoroughly constitutionalist until the people feel that they have made the Constitution, that it belongs to them, that they've been consulted, that they've been involved, that they understand it. And by my perception, Ukraine has never had such a process. Now, don't get me wrong, of course, it's had constitution-making process, but it's been a top-down, elite-driven process, I believe, from the beginning. And many of these elites, I should rush to say, are very well-meaning. I mean, they wanted to create a good constitution. It's just when you ask people in Ukraine, what do you think about the Constitution? Many people won't even know what you're talking about. So obviously, they have not yet been pulled in. So without such a constitution, without such a process, the Constitution won't work because the people don't feel like it's part of them. They don't feel like it's part of their will, and so they're not committed to it. Now, again, we have actually very good empirical evidence on this, that constitutions in which the people participate in their making tend to last a long time. And constitutions that have not had popular participation tend to fall apart, right? And so I think we all have to worry at this particular moment about the stresses that Ukraine is under, because very commonly what happens is constitutions fall apart when you've got an existential foreign threat. So in addition to all of that, probably the Constitution is also going to be the wrong Constitution on the merits for the country, because the people haven't really been consulted. And so they have not really chosen the tools, the constitutional tools, to help them get at their problems. Okay, now, all that's about constitutions. We're going to now segue to the social contract. The point in constitutional frameworks, of course, is to allow pluralism, right? That is, we don't all have to think the same. We don't have to belong to the same religion or the same ethnic group or the same political party. And different people will have different views. And so constitutions ideally should protect this pluralism. But the complication is that on one thing, we actually need unity. We can't have radical pluralism, and that's the constitutional framework itself. It actually needs supermajoritarian support, and the more the better. So if you get countries like the US, actually, where 95% of the people will say, yes, I believe in the Constitution, then that's really good, because it means that if there's a disagreement, they're prepared to work it out through constitutional means. When people don't feel that way about the Constitution, often what will happen is they'll start acting in extra constitutional ways, or the country will even disintegrate into civil war. Okay? So we're looking here for real unity. We're going to need agreement on the means by which we resolve disagreements, right? So disagreements for the great mine run of things, but agreement on these foundations. Okay, now, if you've got a constitution, once it's made and once you get loyalty to it, people can sort of rely on that unity, and we hope that it doesn't disintegrate. But the interesting question for me in Ukraine is, before such a constitution is made, before people actually feel that unity around it, we're going to need to look to create some kind of unity that will provide a consensual basis here. So in other words, if you go out and ask people, like what's going to be the basis for the unity that will give rise to the Constitution, such that we all support it, and you get 8 different answers from 8 different people, then we're in kind of an issue. We're going to need some kind of process to build greater unity to forge around that question. So then the question is, where do we find it? How do we create it if it doesn't already exist? Now here, let me just for a moment drop into John Locke, although Locke here is only illuminative, I mean in his hermeneutic. It's often said that John Locke talked a lot about the social contract, and he did, but he really talked about 2 contracts, and often people elide them when they talk about this. The first contract is the social contract, and Locke had a very particular meaning for this. By the social contract, he meant the contract by which a bunch of people commit to each other to form a people and share a future. In other words, to form a society. Now, at this moment, government has nothing to do with this, right? In his mind, we just kind of coalesced around a certain kind of cultural unity, and that's it. And we decided we belong together. But government has not yet entered the picture. Government enters the picture with the second contract, and that's the rectoral contract. And so now what happens is society, having formed at the first stage, makes a contract with government, creates a government, and vests it with certain powers and puts certain limits on it. Now, typically these days, that rectoral contract is identified by the with the Constitution. Okay. Now, here's the reason I separate these two. The way Locke talked, and it's completely understandable, is the social contract must come first, because it's the social contract that gives us the unity out of which the rectoral contract grows. So we build the rectoral contract, these consensual procedures for resolving disagreements, on a pre-existing kind of social and cultural unity. Okay. Now, then the question is, of course, what is the social contract in Ukraine? Because if we're going to build a constitution that will keep us from falling apart, we're going to need to build it on something. And Locke took the view that it was going to need to be this kind of social contract. But what's the social contract for Ukraine? Now, here I'm conscious that I have to tread carefully because many people take different views. And so all I can report is what I saw. Now, a social contract might be based on political traditions. It might be based on the fact that we've been a country, a polity for a long time, and we have ways of governing ourselves. But I don't think that's true for Ukraine. It has been, in fact, an independent political unit only for short periods. We have the 1648 hetmanate, of course, but that was a long time ago. And it was built around very different political forms, and nobody's seriously talking these days about bringing back the hetmanate. So although this can be a symbol of unity, it's not really going to be the political basis for a social contract. Now, 1917 to 1921 is incredibly interesting. And there were lots and lots of political forms, but that's the whole point. There were lots and lots. And I think it would just be inaccurate to say during 1917 to 1921 that to the extent Ukrainians were unified, it was not around a political form. It was not around a political tradition. In fact, it was political traditions actually that divided Ukrainians during that time. Now, then we get to 1990 to 91, and by my reading of history, there was a virtually universal desire for independence, but again, not absolute unanimity, not nowhere close to it, on what political form it should take. Certainly no political traditions, because by that point, the only living political traditions were Soviet political forms. And there actually were some people who wanted to maintain them, but there were many, many people who wanted to break away. So if we're going to find a social contract, it's not going to be here. And I believe that since that time, no social contract on political structure has emerged. And in fact, Ukrainians over and over have told me, will tell people that in fact, we don't like politics at all. It is definitely not the basis for our unity. Now, then, of course, another possibility is traditional identity categories. And the reality here is, again, by my perception, though I know this is controversial, a true social contract really can't be based around ethnicity or religion or language. Now, that's not to say that it's illicit for ethnicity or religion or language to play a part in politics. But when we're looking for a social contract, we're looking for the very basis of our unity, the foundation for building a constitution. And we can't really say, for example, that the social contract in Ukraine is built around the Ukrainian language unless we're prepared to exile Russian speakers, which I don't think we're prepared to do. And it can't be based around ethnicity unless we're prepared to say, well, Jews don't belong, which I don't think we're prepared to do, and so forth, right? So these things will play a role, but they can't be the basis. They can't be the fundament. And of course, we know Ukraine was very diverse early on. Demographic engineering around the two world wars reduced that diversity, but did not eliminate it. And most people think, of course, that demographic engineering was a very bad thing. So at independence as of now, to be part of the people of Ukraine, I don't think means you must be ethnically Ukrainian or speak Ukrainian or be part of the Orthodox or the Greek Catholic Church. So that's not going to work either. Now, I will mention just in passing before I turn to what I think is really the only lively possibility, and that is some people have said to me that there may be a unifying Ukrainian culture, and they tend to associate it with villages. And it may be there's something there. I'm still thinking it through and still listening to people. And I should also say, though, there are lots of other people who say, oh, no, it absolutely isn't based around village life. That's romantic and nostalgic. And actually, most young Ukrainians are eager to move beyond that. Okay. Now, if we then put aside culture, the only real possibility remaining is a kind of a civic identity. That what it means to belong to Ukraine is to be a citizen of Ukraine and to be building the polity. Now, this also means it's very forward-oriented, not backward-oriented. That what's happening here is we're putting a country together, and we're thinking through issues in a shared political space. And what we saw in the Maidan was people turning out to claim their political future, to assert that they had the right to play a hand in constructing a future Ukraine defined as a civic and political entity. Okay, now here's the only complication to all that. I actually kind of think that's right. I mean, I'm pretty confident that's right. But what that really means is if that's the basis of the social contract, well, that's the same thing as the electoral contract, right? Because building this civic identity, building this civic experiment, that's what constitutions do. And so the social and electoral contract are very closely linked, indeed almost identified, and occurring at the same time, rather than the one preceding the other. Now that, of course, may be part of why there's this great difficulty, right? That what's happening is we're trying to do both of these at the same time, and that is really, really never easy to do. Now, having said that, I should add, it's actually fairly common. That is, countries very often find themselves in the situation that they build the social contract through building the electoral contract. In other words, through building the Constitution. And there's an argument to be made that that's actually what happened in the United States, that most of our genuine nationwide social contract was built through constitution making. So it can be done, but it's going to be difficult. And there are going to be problems. And let me just mention the three that I think are very common and that are likely to occur in Ukraine. The first is that if there's no pre-existing social contract in building the electoral contract, it's very likely that the executive president, again, is going to dominate the process of constitution building and thus dominate the process of building the social contract. And without a social contract, there's not that much to push back, right? People are likely to just go along because, after all, at least the president is leading. And so it may be that before anything else happens, it's going to be important to dial back the power of the executive even before starting a constitutional reform process. Now, the second problem that often happens here when there's no social contract, again, is that people are kind of disunified, and that gives the elite lots of room to maneuver. And they can often manipulate the process so as to make sure that they remain powerful. Now, here, of course, obviously, we would be thinking about the oligarchs, but there are probably many other people in Ukraine as well. And then finally, without a social contract, you're likely to find a lot of popular confusion and ennui, because again, people aren't really used to talking about constitutions and structures. They're not even really used to talking about the social contract. And so they're likely to be disengaged. And if they're likely to be disengaged, it's going to be really, really difficult to build the social contract through constitution making. Usually, when we get participation in the Constitution, again, it's because there's this pre-existing set of social resources that impel people to participate. But in Ukraine, that might not be so. And so I'd worry a lot about insufficient participation. Okay, I'm going to skip this section because I've gone on a little too long. Now, here's what I can say. I think Ukraine really did experience promising conditions for the beginning of a social contract twice: the Orange Revolution and the Revolution of Dignity. These events were actually miracles for the world. They were testament to the power of the human spirit. I think they caused every right-thinking free person to want to stand with Ukraine, as every right-thinking free person should want to stand with Ukraine now, because they were just remarkable events. And I never tire of hearing people talk about them, the people who were there, because it provides so much inspiration. So something really important happened there. The problem, of course, is that it wasn't ever actually translated into an enduring constitution. That what happened at the end of that was mostly a deal between elites about how they were going to divide power. And so to whatever extent that was starting a social contract that might have led to a constitution, they might have occurred at the same time, but they didn't. And so everybody felt like there was so much promise, and then it all just fizzled. And that's the reality, right? When you get these big social movements, they're going to fizzle unless you give them institutional form, and that means constitution building. And some of the difficulty here is that that social contract in the Maidan, which was so real and lively and incredibly moving, all of that happened outside of government, and indeed, in many ways, against government. It was in opposition to the government of the day, but for at least some people, it was opposition to the idea of government itself. And as long as Ukrainians take that view, that feeling on the Maidan is not going to be translated into lasting improvement. So here's what I have to say about the future. A revolution, when our hearts are on fire, that's never going to be enough. That's wonderful to look back on and to remember. It tells us what the human spirit can do. But that idealism is going to have to be translated into realistic, long-run, resilient constitution making. So that beginning of the social contract can then nurture the rectoral contract, which can in turn help to nurture the social contract. But what I saw in Ukraine is that this is the piece that is missing: the development of responsive, resilient institutions that people actually believe in. And that's the core thing, that they believe in because they believe it's theirs. So idealism without structural reform will not long survive. But I do want to close with this. Any country that can generate the Maidan protests has the social capital necessary to give rise to a participatory constitutional process that can in turn give rise to a new social contract, and one that is worthy of the people of Ukraine. Because as much as many Ukrainians, I think, put on a cynical mask often to say we don't believe in government, we won't let ourselves believe in government, nonetheless, they believe deeply in the idea of Ukraine. And the only way to protect that in the long run is to make sure that government serves it rather than defining government in opposition to it. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you so much for this very, I would say, inspirational on the one hand and very insightful presentation and talk. And at this point, we can start our Q&A session. Please submit your questions and comments in our Q&A box and Q&A option. I would like to go back to this statement about the necessity to build civic identity. So you mentioned that you traveled to Ukraine twice. Yep. Right, twice at this point. And
I've zoomed in perhaps a dozen times to give lectures and so forth.
Right. And you will go back at some...
I'm back either in March or May, depending on what Mr. Putin does.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
I've been in many war zones before, so I'd be happy to be there. I just don't want to be a burden. And so people have other things to do. I don't want to visit myself upon them, but I will definitely be back as soon as possible. And I should add, the place that I've worked the longest is in Southeast Asia. I was just there in December. That was my 52nd trip to Southeast Asia. So I look forward to 50 more trips to Ukraine before I'm done.
Well, I do hope that you'll go back in May. Well, so I would like to go back to this statement about the necessity to build civic identities. And from what you saw so far in Ukraine, how can this civic identity be built, and what is missing? And you did explain what's missing, but there is this constant tension between the people, the population, and between the government. No matter what government comes, there is always criticism. Just like with the recent elections, Zelensky received an overwhelming support of more than 70%. However, 2 years later, those people who voted for him and who elected him are disappointed again, and they criticize the government. So how this civic identity can develop, and what are the productive, probably the most productive points, aspects that we should consider?
Well, that's a great question. And so what I would like to begin with is, again, by offering the caveat that I'm just new here, right? I'm on the steep part of the learning curve. And so I will offer some observations with the proviso that, there's every chance that I'll change my mind in a year and that people will correct me. So this is just very tentative. So here's what I've seen. A lot of Ukrainians are very oriented toward their family and friends. And they've adopted this view that that's the safe place. That's the place where you get nurturance. That's the place you can trust. And in fact, you kind of turn to them to take care of things rather than to the government. So it's important to know somebody. Now, all of this is completely understandable. This is in part the residue of the Soviet legacy. Almost everybody in the post-Soviet domain feels this way. And so as a result, there's not that much in the public sphere, right? There's a feeling of deep connection, but it's to your particular group of people. Now, on the other hand, what's really interesting to me, and this is really not true everywhere in the post-Soviet world, is when you ask people, do you believe in the idea of Ukraine? Almost always everybody says yes. Now, they can even say, I don't believe in the country of Ukraine, but I believe in the idea of Ukraine. And then when you ask, so what does it mean? There's typically a very long pause. And it's clear it's getting very hard to formulate. Now, I think that's very, very interesting. And part of the reason I can't give you a really definitive answer is, of course, I think Ukrainians need to ask that question of each other and then talk about it in a public space. And at a minimum, I think what you would finally end up hearing is something like, we believe in humane values, and humane values have been under threat for a long time. And the humane values will be connected to democracy and the rule of law. And they're, of course, enormously under threat right now because of Mr. Putin. So it's going to be something around that, right? And there's going to probably be something around belonging to Europe, though in a complicated way. Now, what I'm suggesting here is that it's an odd moment because clearly Ukrainians are capable of occupying public space. That's what the Maidan protests were all about and what the Donbass is all about. But at the same time, an awful lot of what the Maidan was also about was the individuals standing right next to you, right? The people who had your back, who were going to take care of you. So how do we give rise to something bigger and more vivid and more visionary that can then move us towards something else? And so the short answer is I don't really know yet. That's part of why I want to keep coming back again and again. What I do know, though, is that conversation needs to be held in public and not just in people's living rooms or in coffee houses or tea houses. Now, often a constitution-making process can really, really help in that respect. If it's properly designed, and I have seen this happen, it will give an automatic forum for people to talk about what is central to them, because they can't talk about constitutional forms unless they also talk about identities. And so sometimes you see these identities constructed around, believe it or not, a rather technical discussion of constitutional design. And so that's the piece of it with which I'm most familiar. With the rest, Ukrainians know much better than I do.
Well, I have this follow-up question about teaching the country's constitution at different levels, because your talk somehow made me think about the Ukraine's constitution that was taught to me when I was a student at high school. And the thing that stuck with me was not probably very significant because I don't know, well, I do believe that I had a great teacher, but still the only question that was specified was that the Ukrainian language is the official language in Ukraine, and that's what seemed to be important for teachers to emphasize when teaching constitution. So maybe you could share your experience of teaching this kind of subject, not maybe only on the university level, but maybe at lower levels, at the most basic levels. Maybe this better understanding of what constitution is and what constitution does on a social level, on the governmental level as well. Maybe that's can somehow contribute to this building of civic identities, or to this understanding of who I am as an individual in terms of the country, in terms of the society, in terms of the whole structure, so to speak.
Thank you. So let me first comment on language, and then we'll talk about this process. So, of course, it's completely legitimate for Ukrainian to be the official language of Ukraine. That does not mean it's the basis for the social contract. Those are different issues, right? So you might need an official language just because you need to be able to communicate. But to say that it's at the basis of the social contract is to say that people who speak other languages don't really belong. And of course, that's a very troubling move. Now, part of what I would like to suggest, though, is to turn this a little bit and to say that perhaps it's not as much about teaching as it is about making. That is, what's missing here is not that Ukrainians aren't taught about the Constitution, it's that they don't feel that they made it, and therefore it doesn't belong to them. And when you try to teach people stuff that they didn't make, that can verge on indoctrination, right? Because their hearts just aren't going to beat faster, right? I mean, that is, people just get moved and inspired by the Maidan, but not that many get moved and inspired by the Ukrainian Constitution. Not that many are going to say, I would die to defend that Constitution. And this is different from constitutions in other countries where people would say that, actually. Now, again, I want to stress that's only because Ukrainians had not had the opportunity to develop a constitution that they feel truly belongs to them. So the first process of teaching and learning actually occurs through the process of making, as Ukrainians learn together and figure out together where they want to go with this. Now, I will say this about the time that I spent there, because I delivered a very large number of lectures on Ukrainian constitutionalism. And I should specify, I can't remember that I've ever taught constitutions to pre-college students. So I don't have a lot to comment on that. In fact, I've rarely taught constitutions to college students. Usually I just handle graduate students. And the same was sort of true in Ukraine. But I'll say this, people were very, very motivated. People really care about what happens to their country. And so there is a great spirit, I think, to participate in a public venture if people feel that it's sincere, that it's not just a cover for something else, that it's not just a mask for self-interest, that they're not just being manipulated, that they really do own it. I think there's a great, great impulse to do this. And so what I would look forward to is a process of Ukrainians teaching each other about this instead of something being handed down from on high.
I would like to go back to your observations about Ukraine during your trips. From what you observed, do Ukrainians see their country as a democracy? Because, and what's their attitude to this kind of perception of their country? Because when turmoils start, there is this tendency among the Ukrainians to crave for some strong hand again, which goes back to the past and particularly to the Soviet past.
Yeah, so I actually do believe that. So whether Ukrainians believe their country is a democracy is a really interesting question. And again, this is one where I'm on very thin ice because I'm still learning and many Ukrainians will know much more than I will. And I think the important thing to observe is that democracy is not one thing. And so as a result, many people are very cynical about democracy, but what they're really cynical about are the bad manifestations of democracy. And the reality is, as scandalous as it is to admit, a deeply corrupt democracy is often much worse than a competently run government without a lot of democracy, as long as it's actually delivering the goods. And so in this country, as well as in Ukraine, I think, what a lot of people want is just a government that's clean, that delivers services, that just does a good job. And the difficulty is in the long run, that doesn't happen without a certain measure of democratic participation. That's just what we've learned is that in the end, we'll end up back in Soviet times, when in fact, there was a strong hand, but there was a very incompetent government that was paying no attention to what was happening to ordinary people. So there's really no substitute here for that kind of participation. Now, what I think probably Ukrainians would say, but again, this may just be my perception of what's going on, Ukrainians have elections. And so in that sense, they have democracy, but it's an extremely imperfect democracy. And in many ways, it's a corrupt democracy. And by that, I mean that, in fact, government cannot be counted on to do what people look to government to do. And again, I think that's because of the absence of constitutionalism and the absence of public ownership of the project. So that a lot of Ukrainians have kind of just accepted the idea, We'll elect somebody. We hope that person will be the strong hand, the strong man who will make sure everything works. And after we elect them, we just go back to private life and talk with our family, because that's the only place that anything is actually rewarding. Now, as soon as that happens, as soon as you turn away, you guarantee, of course, that corruption will enter in the long run, because any functioning democracy requires public supervision.
I can but ask this question about corruption, and we had this conversation earlier when we met in January, that corruption is usually pointed out as one of the major issues for Ukraine, and as soon as we overcome somehow corruption, Ukraine will have better chances to join the EU, for example, or to even NATO. And you shared some comments and ideas on this understanding of corruption, and you also pointed out that you see the reforms in a constitution as a way to deal with corruption. So would you comment on?
Sure. So there are basically two ways to approach corruption. There's ex ante and ex post. And by ex post, what I mean is corruption has happened. Now we punish it. Now, when people talk about anti-corruption programs, that's mostly what they mean. And so what we're going to do is we're going to try to deter future corruption by punishing present corruption. And I should say, I think that's quite important. And I actually got started. One of my early jobs was prosecuting political corruption. So it's an important facet of it. The difficulty is by itself, it's completely inadequate and it's not going to go away. And I have to admit, I have some frustration with the international community because they pour millions and millions of dollars into Ukraine in anti-corruption programs and nothing ever changes. So it's kind of the same thing again, that you do the same thing over and over and you expect the different result this time around. And so you would hope the international community would start to think, well, what's going wrong here? Now, and here's the thing, for constitutional designers, people who think about this, what we realize is that the solution is never ex post, it's always ex ante. And ex ante means you set up the structure so that corruption is much less likely to happen in the first place. And because by the time you get to prosecuting it, it's just way too late. Now, there are many pieces of this, of designing a constitution that is going to be relatively resistant to corruption. But at least two parts of this, I think, are relevant here. The first is we got to get over the idea that corruption is all about individual misconduct, violating some rule book out there, right? That is the real problem we have to go after. What really drives corruption is the overconcentration of power. And when you've got an overconcentration of power at the top in the president, almost everything then flows downhill from there. So all of this is based on this model of impacting too much power in one place. It's diffusing power that allows us to move forward. Now, connected to that, of course, the only way corruption is actually going to be reduced is if the public is really, really involved in overseeing it. So again, the pieces are the same here. And if the people have just accepted that like corruption is just a part of our life, it's how we are, what are you going to do about it? And again, then they go for completely understandable reasons to take their pleasure wholly in the private sphere, there's going to be nobody to police it. And so the kind of the public measures that have succeeded in this are those that directly involve the people constantly in overseeing their government. So again, what we need here is a much greater involvement of the people and much more deconcentration of power, checks and balances, and public participation.
We've got a comment from Hiraki Kuromiya, and the comment takes us back to the previous conversation about the events which somehow prevent you from going there right away. Just a comment, Ukraine, like almost all countries, has many problems. It seems to me that the biggest problem and tragedy Ukraine has is Russia. Russians' unwillingness to let Ukrainians build their own future is the most serious threat to Ukraine's constitutional efforts. It's not the case that without Russia's meddling, everything would be okay, but Russia seems to be the most serious problem.
So I think that's probably right. That is, it's hard enough to build a constitution when, again, you got to create a social contract at the same time. But to do so under threat in this way becomes enormously difficult. And it's because it sets up all kinds of domestic dynamics. And now, Natalia, I will anticipate your conference coming up, I think in March. And we've talked about putting together a panel. And this is exactly what I'm thinking about for that panel, which is, what does a foreign existential threat do to processes of domestic constitutional reform? Because when everything's absorbed in thinking about that external threat, and you're responding overwhelmingly to that, then you never have the opportunity to figure out who you are as a polity and what kind of a constitution is going to work. Plus, it's going to put pressures on that will probably distort the domestic political sphere. So I think that question is really just right. Now, I'm not in a position to say, yes, absolutely definitively, Russia is the worst, but clearly Russia is a huge part of the problem here in keeping Ukraine from doing this work. And of course, that's not just true now, that's been true for hundreds of years. So this is not a new phenomenon.
And maybe just another question about the future, some future developments in terms of Ukraine's potential joining the European Union. So does it somehow, is it somehow connected with what you're doing or with what you researching in terms of this possible changes in Ukraine's constitution?
Yeah, the short answer is no. That is, whether Ukraine can or should join the EU is an extremely interesting question. But for me, it's completely independent of constitutional reform in Ukraine. And that's critical for the work that I do, right? Because when I go work in a country, I think of myself very much as working for the people of the country. And I'm hoping to help them figure out constitutional structures that will allow them to realize their hopes and dreams. Now, if I find that I'm working in a country where I can't share those hopes and dreams, I go home. I just don't move forward anymore. And that has happened from time to time, that there are countries where I thought their values were so mistaken that I just didn't want to participate in it. But I'm not going to force them to do anything, right? Of course. So the reason I'm looking forward to Ukraine is Ukraine is one of the places where the battle for civilization right now is being fought out. And it is therefore of world civilizational significance. And so for me, the whole question is, what do Ukrainians want? Now, if they want European accession, that of course is completely up to them. And it may be that stuff we do will lead to that, right? Stuff that happens in the constitutional form will lead to that. But that absolutely cannot be my focus. Now, if, on the other hand, Ukrainians ask me, what are like the 6 things we could do that would make this more likely? Well, then, as a technical matter, of course, I can supply that. So conceptually, always, for me, this is all about domestic work. It's not about international connections, because I really have to view myself as serving people that bit by bit become good friends.
I'm really glad that you asked this question, what Ukrainians want, because right now there are a lot of talks, a lot of discussions about the things which are developing in Ukraine and Russia, and primarily the question which is asked, what does Putin want? But I think it's quite legitimate to ask what Ukrainians want. In terms of, again, well, maybe our final question, in terms of what Ukrainians want, how would you summarize your answer on what Ukrainians want for their future? Is there any definitive answer to this? Do they really have this very clear idea what they want, what we want?
Right. What a great question. And of course, it's very odd for you to ask me this question as a Ukrainian asking an American. So all I can give you is a perception. I think first, no, there is no absolute definitive view. And in fact, I think that's part of the point, is that this is still coming together. It's still, I have the sense that Ukrainians are figuring this out on a daily basis. And what I did keep saying in Ukraine, which I really do believe, is that there's every possibility the next 100 years will be the best 100 years in Ukrainian history. And I wish I could say I were as confident about that for the United States. And that 100 years will be better when Ukrainians have the opportunity to decide for themselves what they want and where they want to go. But I will say two things. I think first, Ukrainians want what everybody else wants. So they want the conditions that will make it possible to lead fulfilling human lives. So they want safety, they want security, they don't want to be under threat from Putin, they want enough food on the table, they want satisfying work, and so forth. They want freedom, they don't want to worry about the police, and so forth. But there's always been this deep spiritual dimension to the idea of Ukraine as well. And what I saw there was this yearning for spiritual meaning as a collective venture. That people want to find out what this promise is, really at a spiritual level, about moving into, living into, becoming this venture that we call Ukraine. And I think it's unclear exactly what that is, but I saw over and over the way people were moved when they spoke about this idea. And so I think in part what they really want is the opportunity to help figure that out for themselves and then put it into action in the world.
Well, thank you so much, David. Thank you so much for this conversation and for your insightful comments. I do feel like this conversation helps to understand what can be done instead of just presenting some statements like it's true for any nation. We want peace, we want prosperity, we want just to be able to build up our lives. And I think it's true. It's a universal, one of universal truths. But how we do it, I think it will be different from country to country, taking into consideration some cultural background, some historical background, and of course the current political situation. So I would like to thank you again for this wonderful conversation today. Thank you, David.
My great pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. Take care.
Thank you so much for joining today for David Williams' talk, Forging a Social Contract in Ukraine. This recording will be available on our YouTube channel. Please subscribe to our channel to view this recording as well as other previous lectures and future lectures. Thank you so much.